Malted barley that's been roasted. That's where you get roast, coffee, cocoa, and smoke. Okay, so let's talk about other grains beyond barley. So barley happens to have a ratio of carbohydrates and proteins that make it great for brewing beer. Wheat and rye also have carbohydrates and proteins, but the ratios are different, and so they're not as successful candidates for actually brewing beer. What do you use wheat for? You can brew a wheat beer, but more commonly you're making bread, you're making pizza dough, things like that. So all those proteins in wheat have, they're glutinous proteins, and so they stick together. And so what they do is they hold on to liquid, they hold on to water, and so that's how you get a dough. But as a brewer, we want to get that water back in the form of wort. So we need to get that water out of the grain. So if you have too much wheat in your recipe, you end up just making dough, and you can't recover wort out of it. So that's why every beer has a large portion of barley in it. These other grains are things that you can add for other flavor as well. So malted wheat is common in wheat beers. A wheat beer recipe, I can't think of a beer that has less than 30% malted barley. So sometimes in a really strong, really wheaty wheat beer, you'd have 30% barley, 70% wheat. But most of the time we're really talking about 50-50 for a wheat beer. But when you add wheat, you're adding fermentable sugars, okay? But you're also adding slight acidity, bready proteins, and pale color. Then you also get wheaty and bready aromas from the wheat, okay? And then malted rye, you're also getting fermentable sugars, but you're getting bready proteins, astringent tannins, and pale color in general. And then also, it's going to end up tasting peppery and spicy almost, and it will have an astringency. And by astringency, it's like tannins basically. So tannins are in the family of polyphenols, and you get polyphenols also from rye. And so that drying feel or texture you get after you drink a really tannic red wine, or like an underripe. What would it be? I was going to say quince. Anyone had underripe quince? I don't recommend it. But there are a lot of fruits out there that have tons and tons of tannins in them, and those tannins are really drying and make your mouth feel like chalk, basically. So don't confuse rye with caraway seed. All right. So caraway seeds are a spice. They're a seed that's frequently added to New York rye or Jewish rye breads that are delicious, but don't expect rye to taste like caraway. So again, there are some rye beers that have caraway added, so those rye beers can taste like caraway. But it's not the rye doing it, it's the caraway. Okay, so adjunct grains like rice and corn, fermentable sugars. However, I was talking about proteins and carbohydrates for things like wheat and barley and rye. Corn and rice are very low in protein. They have some, but it's easily broken down during the brewing process. And so really what you're adding these for is for the fermentable sugars. They don't leave a lot of protein or body in a beer that's brewed with them. They also don't add a lot of color. They don't add a lot of flavor either. They're pretty neutral. So they're sort of a cheap source of fermentable sugars. And so that's why most breweries that use rice and corn will use them. They use them to make the recipe a little bit less expensive and also make the beer a little bit lighter in color, lighter in body, so it's a little bit less assertive. Let's talk about sugars. So cane sugar, beet sugar, corn sugar, those are pretty much the same thing as adding corn and rice. However, they tend to be more expensive than corn and rice, and they also tend to be more expensive than barley. So why would you use those? You would use those in order to keep the beer light in body, but potentially you would sort of feed them. It's kind of a funny way to talk about it, but you could feed them to your yeast if your yeast is an expressive yeast strain. So certain yeasts produce a lot of flavors during fermentation. So Belgian beers, for instance, typically have a lot of sugar that are added to them, okay? But they're also 9-10% alcohol beers a lot of the time. And what happens is the sugar is added to give the yeast more food because the yeast creates most of the flavor in a Belgian beer. Belgian beers are driven by fermentation flavors. So the more sugar you give, whether it's in the form of barley malt or straight beet sugar or cane sugar, the more sugar you give your yeast, the more flavor you're going to get out of it if you use that expressive Belgian yeast strain. However, if you want to get 9 or 10% alcohol in your beer and tons of fermentation flavors, if you cut the body of it with a little bit of straight beet sugar or cane sugar, then you're going to have a lighter, more digestible, easier to drink beer that still has a fair amount of alcohol and lots of fermentation flavor. So we'll talk more about that stuff in the Belgian class. And then honey is obviously another thing that you could add. Has plenty of fermentable sugars, but minimal color, minimal body. I shouldn't say minimal body. If you add enough of it, it can add a sort of a silkiness or a fullness to your beer. Honey has a lot of glycerin in it. It gives it a very smooth mouthfeel, and you can impart that in your beer as well. But obviously aromas of honey and flowers. Speaking of flowers, let's get into hops. All right, so we're out of our fermentables category. Okay, the rest of these things that we're going to add to beer add flavor, and they can do other things kind of to the chemistry of beer, but they don't really add fermentables. So we're done adding carbohydrates and sugar that our yeast is going to consume. Let's talk about other flavoring. So hops, consider them just like a flavoring. We're talking about hops adding bitterness, adding aroma, adding antibacterial properties. Bitterness can balance malt residual sugars. So if you have sweetness in your beer, that bitterness from hops is essential to balance those residual sugars.